by my estimation, and I've talked to a number of legal scholars about this, the most conservative member of the court, the one most likely to vote against arguments made by civil rights organizations and others who believe that the interpretation that Professor Crooms just gave is not appropriate when it comes to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which have been hijacked by the conservative majority on the court and put to purposes that I don't think that the original framers of those bills, who were some of the most radical politicians and most fair-minded politicians in the history of this country, would even recognize. Clarence Thomas is a guy who a lot of black folks, because they got unclear signals initially from some of our civil rights and other leadership organizations, thought that because he was black, that surely he must understand some of the issues that blacks continue to deal with. And I think that they've learned that lesson, and that is that you cannot necessarily equate a person's skin tone with their philosophy and with the approach that they will take. He's been he has issued rulings. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and I would leave it to Professor Crooms to provide the interpretation if we need one. But he has written stuff there that some of the great racist justices of the past would be very comfortable with. Now, Obama, on the other hand, I think there's a possibility that he might appoint someone like Hillary Clinton to the court. It would be a very interesting appointment if that were to come to pass. She certainly would be a force on the court in a way that we haven't. The tendency has been to put people on the court who come out of the law and the judiciary. We used to have a tradition of appointing to the court people who had been governors and senators and so forth, who had a political history behind them, and their approach was somewhat different. Doesn't mean that they didn't use legal reasoning. It just means that they had a different kind of a background, a different kind of exposure, and I think more of an understanding about the impact of some of their rulings on society as a whole. Now, let me just add too, though, that we're focusing on the big visible cases here. There's a whole bunch of little tiny cases that have impact as well we don't see. For example, right now there's a big problem that came about because of a Supreme Court ruling saying that states can require voters to display identification before they're allowed to vote. Well, not everybody has a driver's license. Who are the people who are less likely to have driver's license and state-issued photo IDs? Poor people. Black people are disproportionately poor, disproportionately unlikely to have IDs. Some of them may be excluded. There's a case in Michigan now, a dispute going on in Michigan now because of a fear that blacks will be excluded from being able to vote because of this Supreme Court ruling, a ruling which on its face looks like it might be perfectly fair. What's wrong with requiring people to identify themselves before they're allowed to vote? Well, the impact of it is that it may end up excluding blacks in one of the key swing states from being able to vote. And this is a state that most people think that if Obama can't win Michigan, he probably can't win the election. So it's very crucial.
I would add two things. I think that the other way to think about nominees to the bench generally, but to the Supreme Court in particular, is in terms of judicial temperament. And I think that based on what I've seen in terms of how people have run their campaigns, we'll put it that way, that what I would expect from a McCain administration would probably be candidates who would be more polarizing because they were so driven ideologically. So even though Scalia may in fact be, according to many people, and quite honestly, you read his opinions, you may not agree with them, but they're well written. He's a bright guy. He's real smart, but I think ultimately his influence will be limited because he is such a polarizing figure and is unwilling to bend and compromise. And one of the things I've come to realize about the way the court operates is if you look back at the Warren Court era, which would be during the time during which many of the civil and human rights that we take for granted were recognized by the court, a lot of those cases were in fact accompanied by unanimous opinions. And unanimity was important because Berger understood that the more controversial the issue being resolved, the more of a need for a unified front, so that the people who were charged with enforcing the law would get a clear signal that the Supreme Court solidly stands behind this particular opinion. Brown versus Board of Education, for example, is an excellent example of what a Chief Justice is expected to do in order to get that kind of unanimity. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking that McCain's probably not going to pay that much attention to judicial temperament, and the people who are most vehement about their views regarding the litmus test issues are more likely to be nominated by a McCain administration, and that my sense is that an Obama administration, at least having taught constitutional law, that he gets that the court needs not just people who might agree with him ideologically, or he may come at it and say it doesn't make any difference whether they agree with me ideologically, that judicial temperament is most important. This idea of the difference between laws that have a disparate impact, such as the voter ID laws, crack powder disparities, death penalty sentencing, those sorts of things. I want to take the opportunity to note that a different part of the Constitution, that being Article 6, contains something called the Supremacy Clause. And among the supreme law of the land, or what's included in the supreme law of the land, are the Constitution, the laws passed or made thereunder, and any treaties that we've signed and ratified. The reason why I bring up treaties is we as a country have in fact ratified the preeminent International Human Rights Treaty on the issue of race. It's called the UN International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. In that particular treaty, discrimination is defined so that you get to those things that say, blacks can't rent here, that being discriminatory it's passed for a discriminatory purpose. And you can tell what the purpose is from the text, or laws that are neutral on their face, such as the voter ID law, but have a disparate impact on a racially identifiable group. Either one of those will give rise to discrimination that the government at the very least then has to explain. It just can't say, well, we didn't intend for it to work that way. It's sort of like whether you intended it or not, it discriminates. So that's yet another reason why the election is important, because, based on what limited interaction I've had with either one of the candidates or their camps, the Obama people are much more interested in, repairing our reputation in the international community. And part of that is being a member in good standing and playing by the rules in the UN, which means if you ratify a UN treaty, then you gotta abide by it. You can't ratify it and say, oh, and by the way, the rules don't apply to us, which has been our stance up to this point. So in many ways, the implications of the election sort of radiate. It's here with you personally, but it radiates far beyond us. And I think that, the crowds that you saw Obama draw in Europe over the summer provides further evidence of the fact that we're not the only ones who might be waiting for change, that we've got an entire international community that is looking for someone to step up to the plate and say that, we're going to be held accountable for the stuff that we do. So, preemptory strikes and all sorts of things, invading places, that, we'll stop that because that breaks the rules. And, you're going to treat your people right. And you're going to treat your people right means you're going to recognize their rights, you're going to protect them, you're going to fulfill them, you're going to guarantee them, you're going to do what you need to do rather than continue to sort of pick and choose in terms of which rights you'll recognize and which rights you won't.
All right. Yes, in the green shirt.
My name is Blake, and I was curious if there's any speculation as to who will be leaving the Supreme Court.
The question is, is there any speculation about who will be leaving the Supreme Court? Age?
There's some.
Health-wise.
Mm-hmm. Age and
Justice Stevens is very old, so it's believed he would be the first, and also some idea that Justice Ginsburg would be leaving fairly soon.
Yeah, she's not well either. And of course, you know, as we think about it, who might replace those two justices is the big issue. And of course, when you think about the presidential candidates, you have a sense of who might be chosen by McCain and who might be chosen by Obama. And then that comes back to you and your interest in and involvement in making certain that your viewpoints and the viewpoints of all of your friends are going to be heard. And how does that get heard? You tell me.
Those two, by the way, are two of the four-member, more liberal-leaning bloc on the court. So you can see how important it would be as to who replaces them. And it's also fascinating to me that Stevens was appointed by Richard Nixon.
Right.
You know, Nixon, as bad as he was, in some ways looks awfully good in retrospect.
Yes, Dr. Morris. He's asking about the Judiciary Committee and it vetting a bit more as happened in the past. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Well, you know, I mean, the leadership of the Senate changed since then. Okay, so that's one step. But the other thing that I think would be more important is who's the president, who's making the appointments. My guess is that somebody like John Roberts, who's currently the Chief Justice, I think would have I don't know what kind of argument, whatever the constitution of the committee had been. I don't see how anybody could have rejected John Roberts. Even Obama himself has said that he couldn't really make an argument against Roberts based on the merits. Now, Clarence Thomas is another matter because Clarence Thomas was not given the highest ratings by the Bar Association and others, so it's a different issue. But it mostly has to do with who's making the appointments, and that's the president. And I think that's more important than who is on the committee in the Senate.
I guess the question that I would have for you is how many of you are registered to vote? All right.
Good.
How many of you are helping with voter registration? Okay. I am hopeful that more hands would be raised just because this is monumentally important. It's not as important to those of us who are on the other side of college education, but it is very important for you. And I think all of us are saying the same sort of thing, that you really have to get engaged in this because the future is really in the hands of the person who will be stepping in as President of the United States. Now, yes?
Solidly to the right.
But-
Why do you think that argument never seems to
This is Ron Harris, my friend and colleague, and now a member of Howard University's.
I just came over to give you a hard time.
You did.
But you want to repeat the question?
The question is why is it? I mean, people are always arguing that it's very important. That an important issue in deciding who should be president is what kind of Supreme Court nominations they're going to make. But it doesn't seem to really cut with the voters. And why is that? Fair summation of okay. Elections are real complicated, and they're rarely decided on. In most cases, they're rarely decided on one issue alone. And the question of Supreme Court nominations is almost. It's almost a two-step process. There are other issues which are more direct. Taxation, for example, is a straight-up kind of thing that affects people directly, easy to understand. When you're talking about Supreme Court nominations, you're asking people to look down the line instead of what's immediately in front of them, and I think it's difficult. On the other hand, my suspicion is that there are people for whom this is a very important issue. This year, for example. The fact that Obama was not able to get support during the primary campaign from many of the women who were backing Hillary Clinton. The thought was that